Hello, everyone. This is Boniface from Unam Sanctam Catholicam. It is October 26th, 2022. And just yesterday, I saw an article on the website The Catholic Thing by Father Peter Stravinskas entitled What is Really Needed for a Eucharistic Revival. And this had to do with the ongoing bishops. I don't know if it's a synod or what is it exactly, the 3-year long Eucharistic revival that the USCCB is undertaking in the United States. And Father Stravinskas goes over several things that he believes are needed for a Eucharistic revival. And I wanted to review this article briefly because it really highlights that there's no good arguments for the Novus Ordo anymore. I mean, I don't think there ever were any good arguments, but I should say that the traditional arguments of the reform of the Reform school of thought look more ridiculous today than they ever did. And this article really throws it into relief. Now, the Catholic Thing, it's a decent website. It's pretty normie, pretty mainstream. Father Stravinskas, he's been around for a long time. I used to read him, when I first came into the church 20 years ago. And when I was a DRE, he made these very handy little books just answering basic questions about Catholicism. And like many Reform of the Reform people, I think his heart is in the right place, and I applaud him for saying the things he's going to say here. But we're going to see why this is just why this doesn't make any sense. So let's dive into this article here. What's really needed for a Eucharistic revival? And he starts off by noting that the American bishops are very concerned about the widespread loss of faith in the Most Holy Eucharist, and they're launching a 3-year Eucharistic revival. And I think we all know how that's going to go, right? It's going to be a lot of talking, some documents, and then nothing's going to come of it. But he says, rightly so, if we don't address the root causes of unbelief, namely that the signs of symbols of the sacred liturgy no longer support the teaching, then all the teaching, preaching, and programs in the world will avail nothing. And that's certainly true. This is a basic lex orandi, lex credendi, right? He's saying that if we don't fix the lex orandi, then the lex credendi is going to remain broken. So now he's going to give us what he calls some modest proposals for fixing the lex orandi. So let's see what he says here. So number one, he points out the loss of Latin. The Council Fathers of Vatican II gave us the possibility for using the vernacular, but they were quite clear that Latin should not only be retained in the liturgy, but that the faithful should respond to the Latin prayers. Every major religion has a sacral language, lest the pedestrian override the sacred. Banishing Latin has contributed to the balkanization of parishes as various ethnic groups split off into their separate communities. So he's concerned that the pedestrian is going to override the sacred due to the loss of Latin. Father Stravinskas, what liturgy do you think would be best suited for the preservation of Latin? Could it be, I don't know, the traditional Latin Mass of the Latin Rite, maybe? Like if you're that concerned about Latin, why not just go back to the Latin Mass, right? All right, let's go back to this here. Whoops, there we go. The movement of the tabernacle. Paul VI referred to the tabernacle as the living heart of each of our churches. So why the relegation of the tabernacle to the side altar, separate chapel, or closet, resulting in the replacement of Christ at the center, usually by an enthroned priest? With the tabernacle off the central axis, should we be surprised by people chatting as they enter the church as if they were in a movie theater? Well, very good point. Of course, we could ask when were the altars all moved? When were the high altars destroyed? When was everything stripped? When was the sanctuaries? When were the sanctuaries of our churches reformed to become assembly halls? After the Second Vatican Council, with the abandonment of the traditional Latin Mass and the adoption of the Novus Ordo. And the reason this happened, and there's a connection here, I'm surprised Father Stravinskas doesn't mention it. The reason the sanctuaries were reconstructed, I mean, it was in the name of the spirit of the council. But remember, one of the major liturgical innovations of the council was versus populum worship. And it was believed that with the new orientation of versus populum, the traditional orientation ad orientem was no longer sufficient. You had to have the congregation reflecting that view of the priest and the people dialoguing with each other, and that was kind of the ideological motivation behind reconstructing a lot of our sanctuaries. And that, of course, is something that's proper to the Novus Ordo, which is versus populum. Father Klaus Gamber, in his book, says that that's the most that is the defining characteristic of the Novus Ordo is versus populum worship. So if you're concerned about the I guess the right orientation of our sanctuaries, then it makes sense to go back to the traditional Latin Mass. All right. So he goes on, revival of altar rails. Ripping out altar rails has obscured the necessary distinction between the sacred and the profane. The altar needs to be visually set apart because what is enacted there is removed from our commonplace experience of daily life. Heaven coming down to earth. With this distinction lost, those of us on earth have difficulty ascending to heaven. Okay, again, if you like communion at the altar rails, go back to the traditional Latin Mass, where communion was always received on the tongue at the altar rail. I talks about the communion fast. Prior to Pope Pius XII, the communion fast began at midnight. That was detrimental to frequent communion, and so Pius XII wisely mitigated the fast to 3 hours for solid foods and 1 hour for liquids. Paul VI modified the fast even further to the present discipline, namely 1 hour. The purpose of the Eucharistic fast is to make us feel physical hunger. Okay, now this, strictly speaking, doesn't have to do with the Novus Ordo directly, because the tinkering with the Eucharistic fast had begun before the institution of the Novus Ordo. And I agree with him that, at least the Eucharistic fast back up to 3 hours would be ideal. And there is a real strong, he's right that the point of a fast is to make you feel physical hunger. And if we're commuting sometimes, it takes, if I go to the Latin Mass in Detroit, for example, that takes me an hour to get there. I can literally be eating till the moment I walk out the door, and still keep the fast. So I'd be in support of that. Not strictly relevant to the Novus Ordo, although, of course, it's very connected culturally with the Novus Ordo, because with the Novus Ordo, we see the relaxation of discipline across the board. Let's go on here. What does he say next? Standing for Holy Communion. Or that is to say, we should be kneeling for Holy Communion. For centuries, Catholics of the West have knelt to receive the Eucharistic Lord. The problem is not so much with standing as such, but with the lack of any sign of reverence. Have we forgotten St. Augustine's admonition? No one eats the flesh without first adoring it. We should sin were we not to adore it. Okay, so he wants communion to be received with signs of reverence. Again, what liturgy has structured into the rubrics the reverential reception of Holy Communion? Kneeling on the tongue at the rails, the traditional Latin Mass. The traditional Latin Mass, Father, that's what you need. He doesn't realize it, but that's what you need. Okay, now he goes on to versus populum. Mass facing the people, the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice is a true novelty. That is, versus populum celebration is a true novelty. In every religion where sacrifice has been offered, from biblical Judaism to the worship of the pagan Greeks and Romans, priest and people face the same direction. presumably facing the divinity being implored. Ironically, versus populum is far more clericalist than ad orientem because it makes the priest the center of attention. And this is such a fantastic point. This is one of the best arguments against versus populum, that it actually supports and reinforces clericalism by placing all the focus on the celebrant, who becomes essentially like the almost like the MC of the liturgy. But versus populum, going back to Klaus Gamber, that is the definitive characteristic of the Novus Ordo. Of course, you'd never have versus populum in the traditional Latin Mass. Now, I know the Reform types will say, and they're correct, that the rubrics of the Novus Ordo itself don't strictly call for versus populum. If you read the Novus Ordo rubrics, they presume that for many parts of the liturgy, the priest has his back to the congregation. And we know this because there's several parts in the missal where it'll tell the priest now turn around to face the congregation, the implication being that the priest would have been facing away from the congregation. But we know that the reality on the ground is that 99% of Novus Ordo Catholic parishes are celebrating versus populum. And he says it's a complete novelty. Father Stravinskas says this, that it's a complete novelty, and yet he's still advocating for the liturgy where 99% of the masses are a complete novelty. I don't know why, after admitting this, after saying right here that that versus populum is a true novelty and that it's clericalist, why you wouldn't advocate for the Mass where you don't ever have versus populum. I don't know. All right, now he's going to talk about extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion. He goes on to point out, now this is interesting. He says extraordinary ministers go back to a document called Immense Caritatis, 1973, of Paul VI, where the Pope gave very precise indications for recourse for the non-ordained to distribute Holy Communion. And then he says they were incorporated into the Code of Canon Law. And then the next sentence, Father Stravinskas says, I have never seen a situation where these norms are followed. That is the story of post-conciliar Catholicism. You might have these texts like Immense Caritatis or Sacrosanctum Concilium, which say the Latin language is to be preserved. And he says here, in the case of extraordinary ministers, I have never seen a situation when those norms are followed. Never, never. Now, I mean, I think extraordinary ministers, even according to Immense Caritatis, are a bad idea. But he's saying that he's never even seen the norms promulgated after the council observed. Vatican II, as it exists on paper, is an abstraction. It's an artificial construct that is never actually observed anywhere in the real world. And he recognized that here. And he goes on to say, lay distribution of the Holy Sacrament that diminishes the two sacraments. What is he saying here? So I lost my spot here. Lay distribution of the Holy Sacrament diminishes two sacraments, the nature of the Eucharist and the unique identity of the ordained minister. Okay, that's interesting. We often hear arguments against lay people distributing Holy Communion because of the potential of irreverence, things like that. But it's also denigrating the sacrament of the priesthood, who are uniquely ordained for the purpose of the distribution of the sacrament. So he says that it actually is diminishing two sacraments. So he says it's diminishing two sacraments, and that he's never ever in his whole priesthood of many decades seen the norms followed, but yet he still wants the Mass where this is the norm. Why? Then he goes on and says communion in the hand. He talks about how this began as an abuse in the Low Countries, and how it was incorporated in the church, in his words, quote, through the machinations of Cardinal Joseph Bernardin. through the illicit polling of absent bishops through mail-in ballots. Whoops. Oh, well, there's a method that didn't age well, eh? And then he talks about how communion in the hand, how we have it today, was not the practice of the early church, and that it's actually Protestant. And then he says it was brought in at the time of the Protestant Reformation. It is no surprise then that 70% of Catholics do not believe in the real presence and have a truncated understanding of the sacred priesthood, along with a concomitant decline in priestly vocations since the introduction of communion in the hand more than 4 decades ago. So he not only understands that communion in the hand is not our tradition, he understands that the concept comes from Protestantism. He understands that it crept in as an abuse in the Novus Ordo, and that it has led to, in his own words, 70% of Catholics not believing in the real presence, a truncated understanding of the priesthood, and a catastrophic decline in vocations. And yet, he does not advocate for the return to the traditional Latin Mass. He still wants to stick with the Novus Ordo, which he basically admits throughout this whole article is a completely failed experiment over 40 years. So let's see what he says in closing here. He says, no element called for here in any way contradicts a single paragraph of Vatican II. Okay. So, yeah, that's what he's ultimately about here. Like, this is the mass that Vatican II calls for. This is the delusion of the reform mentality. You go through all these things, and if you just look at this reasonably, it's like, what you want, Father, is the traditional Latin Mass. That is where you will find all these elements in their fullness, in their richness, according to their traditional forms that have been used for centuries and loved and honored and sanctified by the saints and generations of Catholics and popes, and nurtured the faith of the church through persecution and all these things for centuries. That's what you want. That's what you're getting at here. But then he just kind of goes on to, like, this is what Vatican II really wanted. Again, the council, or I should say the liturgy that Vatican II envisioned is an abstraction. It's a fiction. It doesn't exist anywhere. I mean, maybe some isolated corners of the world. I know in some place like Assumption Grotto in Detroit, they do the Novus Ordo actually according to the rubrics. There's various places where you can find it, but they're like they're like unicorns. The reality on the ground, 99.9% of Catholic parishes are not following. Are not following what the Novus Ordo envisioned. Now, even if they were following all this stuff to the T, what the council documents actually say, it would still be inferior to the traditional Latin Mass. But the point is, as Father Stravinskas pointed out, that these norms are never observed. They just never are. Now, this article struck me as very useless. I respect Father Stravinskas, and I think his heart's in the right place. These are all good things that he wants. These are all very good things. But how many years and decades have we been calling for these things? How many decades? I remember when I was first entering the church in 2002, these same conversations, oh, you shouldn't be having communion in the hand. We should be kneeling. We should be preserved. Vatican II says we should preserve chant. Did it make a difference under the pontificate of John Paul II? No. Did this stuff even come back under Benedict XVI, who had a great respect for the traditional Latin Mass, who said that he wanted the traditional Latin Mass to enrich the Novus Ordo? Even under Benedict XVI, this reform of the Reform program didn't happen. Benedict said lots of great things, but on the ground, nothing changed. Come on, if this didn't happen under Benedict XVI, is it going to happen in the age of Francis, in the age of the Synod of Synods? No way. There's no, the idea now at the end of 2022 of this, oh, you know what would fix this if we just start adhering to the documents of Vatican II and just putting the Latin back in the Novus Ordo and doing our Gregorian chant and getting rid of the extraordinary ministers. Like the idea that that's actually going to happen now in 2022 is, as ridiculous as it's ever been, if not more so. And it just becomes clearer as time goes on. Like they are, guys, I'm talking to you, reform of the reform people. And I used to be one of you. God bless you. I love you. Your hearts are in the right place. But understand this will never, ever, ever happen. Never. You get a parish here and there. You get a good, zealous young priest that comes in and, he's going to hire that music director who's going to do some Latin chants. He's going to introduce communion at the rails. And you're going to be like, this is great. And then that priest's going to get transferred. New priest's going to come in. And as is his prerogatives in the Novus Ordo, he can do the Mass according to the many options he wants. He's going to bring back the guitars. He's going to get rid of the rails. And then you'd be back to nothing. Because that's how it is. In the Novus Ordo, even if you get a reverent Mass, and I do believe that reverent Novus Ordos do exist, but even if you get one, it's kind of by happenstance based on the particular disposition of the priest. So I don't understand. I don't understand how Father Stravinskas says all these things that he wants, ad orientem worship, communion kneeling, Latin, chant, an end to extraordinary ministers, just the return of Eucharistic reverence and belief. Father, go back to the traditional Latin Mass. It's really that simple. It's really not complicated, guys.